For 2 decades, the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte tore Europe apart. They were a revolutionary storm of fire and steel, led by a man considered the greatest military mind in history. He redrew the map of a continent in blood, and his enemies fell before him like wheat before the scythe. So how was this self-proclaimed god of war ultimately defeated? History will tell you it was cannon, cavalry, and the thin red line. But that is not the whole truth. The real secret to Napoleon's ultimate, crushing humiliation was this: a boot. This isn't just a story about footwear. This is the story of 2 warring philosophies, 2 empires, and 2 titans of history. And by the end of this video, you will understand the fatal, catastrophic mistake that cost Napoleon his empire and proved the enduring genius of British pragmatism. The legend of Napoleon was built on speed. His Grande Armée moved faster, struck harder, and achieved more shocking victories than any army in 1,000 years. From the plains of Austerlitz to the deserts of Egypt, they were seemingly invincible. And the secret to their speed was a brutal, revolutionary doctrine. The army would live off the land. They carried no cumbersome supply trains, no vast herds of cattle. They marched light and they marched fast, stripping the countryside bare like a swarm of locusts. In the rich, fertile lands of Italy and Germany, this system was a war-winning weapon. It allowed Napoleon to surprise, outmaneuver, and annihilate his slower, more conventional foes. He mocked the British army, calling its commander Arthur Wellesley, a mere Sepoy general who learned his trade in the backwaters of India. He believed his revolutionary fervor and tactical genius were all that mattered. He was wrong. The system that gave him his greatest victories contained the seeds of his own destruction. It had a fatal flaw. It only worked when the land had something to give. When Napoleon's armies marched into the poor, rugged, and fiercely hostile terrain of Spain in 1808, his system collapsed. The Peninsular War became a bleeding ulcer, an endless nightmare of guerrilla warfare and starvation. The land was barren, the people were hostile. There was nothing to plunder. French soldiers, once the proud conquerors of Europe, were reduced to ragged, desperate bands of foragers. Their uniforms turned to rags, their shoes disintegrated on the rocky Spanish roads, and their discipline evaporated. Disease and starvation killed far more of them than British bullets ever did. While Napoleon was in Paris, dreaming of grand strategy, his men were dying in ditches, their stomachs empty and their feet bleeding. This was the myth of the Grande Armée meeting its grim reality. It was a brilliant tool for a short, sharp campaign. It was a suicidal strategy for a long, grinding war of attrition. And a war of attrition is exactly what the Sepoy general, the Duke of Wellington, gave them. Wellington had learned the business of war in the brutal, unforgiving campaigns of India. He had seen armies wither and die from disease and hunger, and he learned the single most important lesson of military command. Logistics are everything. An army, he knew, marches on its stomach. A soldier fights only as well as he is fed, clothed, and equipped. While Napoleon saw his soldiers as instruments of glory, Wellington saw them as professional assets to be preserved. He was, at his core, a quartermaster, obsessed with detail. He built a logistical machine in the peninsula that was the wonder of the age. He used the total dominance of the Royal Navy to supply his army from the sea. He established massive depots in Lisbon. He organized fleets of river barges and commanded tens of thousands of Spanish and Portuguese mule drivers to haul supplies to the front. While French soldiers were boiling tree bark for food, the British redcoat received his daily ration: 1 pound of biscuit, 1 pound of beef, and a pint of rum. This wasn't generosity. This was cold, calculated, war-winning pragmatism. And this philosophy extended to every single item of his soldiers' equipment, most famously, their boots. The standard cavalry boot of the era was the Hessian. It was tall, ornate, and decorated with tassels. It looked magnificent on a parade ground, but it was hopelessly impractical for a real campaign. It was uncomfortable, it let in water, and it was difficult to maintain. Wellington, a man with no time for pointless decoration, commissioned his own boot from his London bootmakers, Hobie of St. James's Street. He ordered a new design, made of soft, durable calf skin that was treated with wax to be waterproof. It was cut lower to just below the knee, making it far more comfortable for long marches and for life in the saddle. It was tough, it was practical, and it was stripped of all useless ornamentation. It was a tool for a professional soldier. The Wellington boot, as it became known, was the perfect symbol of his entire approach to war. Function over form, substance over style, victory over vanity. While the French army marched in rags and broken shoes, the British army marched in the most advanced, most practical military footwear in the world. They could march further, arrive in better condition, and fight harder than their starving, exhausted opponents. Wellington wasn't just commanding an army, he was managing a system. And his system was simply better. This clash of systems reached its bloody climax on a muddy field in Belgium in June of 1815. The Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon, back from exile, had raised one last army. He needed a lightning victory, a single crushing blow to shatter the coalition arrayed against him. He was relying on his old formula: speed, shock, and the sheer terror of his name. He threw his columns of infantry and his squadrons of heavy cavalry against Wellington's thin red line. The battle was a maelstrom of cannon fire, smoke, and steel. For hour after agonizing hour, the British line was battered, charged, and shelled. It bent, it buckled, but it did not break. Why? Because the men in that line were not a revolutionary mob. They were professionals. They were well-fed, well-equipped, and they trusted the grim, hawk-nosed commander who had led them to victory after victory. They had the physical stamina and the moral resilience to endure the storm. Their steadfastness was not an accident. It was the product of a system that valued the life and welfare of the common soldier. It was the legacy of the rations, the training, and the simple, profound advantage of a good pair of boots. When the Prussian army finally arrived on Napoleon's flank late in the day, they did not arrive to save a broken army. They arrived to reinforce a force that had absorbed the Emperor's best punch and was still standing, ready to counterattack. The victory at Waterloo was not just a triumph of tactics. It was the ultimate vindication of Wellington's entire philosophy. The system of professional logistics had defeated the system of revolutionary plunder. Napoleon's empire was not brought down by a single cannonball or a heroic cavalry charge. It was dismantled piece by piece by a fundamentally superior British approach to the very business of war. Wellington proved that logistics are not a boring footnote to history. They are the absolute bedrock of victory. He professionalized the British Army, transforming it into the most resilient and effective fighting force in the world. This legacy of pragmatism, of quiet professionalism, of focusing on what works rather than what looks glorious, became a cornerstone of the British identity. It is the spirit that built a global empire, that stood defiant against tyranny in the 20th century, and that continues to define the character of the British armed forces to this day. The lesson is timeless. Great generals win battles, but great systems win wars. Napoleon was a genius of the battlefield. Wellington, the Sepoy general, was a genius of war. And in the end, it was the genius of war that conquered. If you believe that British pragmatism is a superpower, then smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to join the ranks of indomitable history. But what do you think? What is the most underrated factor in Britain's long and storied military history? Let us know in the comments below.